Hi everyone, welcome back to Chapter 13, Comparative Cognition. In this video, we are going to talk about tool use, which is super cool, and then we're going to move on to food storing in birds. And I think that's all we'll get through in this video, which means there's 2 videos left. So, let's start with tool use. So tool use is something that way back when humans who thought so much of themselves thought only humans use tools, right? We went through like the Stone Age and the Bronze Age and all that, where we used tools, we made tools, we're so much smarter than all the other animals. Well, it turns out a lot of animals use tools. They will make tools in order to obtain a goal. So a tool, the definition, is just a physical object used to obtain a goal. So for instance, we've got an orangutan here using a pole to say fish, stabbing something else. We've got here a crow using a stick that he actually created. He found the stick, he whittled it with his little teeth and feet, and made a little hook here. And what he can do is he can use that hook to then get a bunch of bugs out from a rotting stump that he wouldn't otherwise be able to reach. And then, of course, we've got an octopus over here that's using, it looks like some rocks. They often use rocks to hide. They'll take, like, say, these 2 halves of the rocks and put them together over them. If you've seen the awesome documentary on Netflix, My Octopus Teacher, then that octopus in there takes a bunch of rocks and coral and disguises itself as a bunch of rocks. And that's a way of using rocks as a tool. So tools aren't just about getting food, it's also about, say, protecting yourself from a predator or hiding, just as long as there's a goal for the use of that tool. Chimpanzees use tools for fishing termites. Wasps will actually also use tools. They'll paralyze a caterpillar, put it in a little nest that it's going to make, lay their eggs on top of that caterpillar, and then fill it with soil or stones, closing that nest, and it will then take a pebble in its mouth, in its mandible, and start pounding the substrate with it, which then compacts and settles the soil, filling that nest so that nothing else can go in and get to her eggs. It's very cool, very creative. Now, there's a lot of different aspects of tool use that we study, one of which is tool modification. So it's not just about do animals use tools, but it's do they modify these tools. So I don't have time to show these videos, but I've given you guys the links to them where there's, let's see, does it work? It does not work. A bunch of birds, in this case crows, were each given 30 trials with a stick, and this stick would be fine, but there's food at the bottom of this thing. And the only way to get to the food would be to take the stick, put it through this tube, and somehow get to the food. Well, it turns out that a straight stick that they were given is not going to be good enough. They need to make a hook of some sort. And so what they found is that all subjects would successfully make a hooked tool. So corvids, so like ravens and crows, are very smart, very good at doing this, but other animals do this as well. There's another type of tool use that we can study, which is called meta-tool use. So this is use of a tool that serves as a tool for another tool. So we see this in great apes as well as in crows. And so here we've got a box, of course. And so to do this, then you need to use a tool to access another tool, so which is a non-food item. And you must resist the immediate motivation to use the tool to access the food directly. So, for instance, we've got like a tube here with a rock, another tube here with a smaller rock, and then a tube here with a piece of worm in it or something. Now, what happens is their birds will be given one stone. Now, they could, of course, put the stone straight in the food to try to get the food. Well, all that's going to do is squish the worm, and you're not going to get the food. Now the food's not accessible. So you need to figure out how can you use this rock to get to the other rocks to then get to the food. Because what happens is this is on like a sliding thing, and if you put this rock in here, then it will cause the weight of this to open up, and the small rock will slide out. And then you can take the small rock and put it in here, and that will add the weight to allow the worm to slide out. So it turns out when testing with Caledonian crows, all of the crows successfully did this the very first trial. They're that smart. It's crazy. And so the results suggest that there may be a general cognitive capacity rather than some sort of adaptive specialization going on. So it's very meta. It indicates a concept which is an abstraction from another concept. Whoa, I know. So this is very advanced. Again, not all animals that use tools can figure this out in the first try, but crows can because they are just ridiculously smart. And then, of course, we've got tool making. So again, I've given you the YouTube video for this one as well, which is really cool, where you put a crow or any animal in a environment where there's no obvious tools, but there's a tube here with food at the bottom, and the animal has to figure out how to get there. Well, what they do is they will actually create their own tools. They might, if there's a plant nearby, they will actually go to the plant and chew off a hook or a spear type thing off of a leaf. They'll create it. So animals not only are capable of using tools, of modifying tools, but of creating their own tools. So this is something we are very related to, say, the Stone Age of humans. And in fact, it's been suggested that many non-human primates are actually in their own Stone Age. They're using stones, they're chipping stones away to make sharper objects, just like humans did in the past to make, say, arrowheads or knives. That's something that some animals have actually started to do themselves. So we see this evolution of animals that seems to be mimicking the evolution of humans in terms of tool use and tool making. So it's very exciting. And again, not all animals use tools, not all animals make tools, but a lot of them do. So that's kind of it for tool use and making that we're going to talk about. Again, it's a very fascinating topic. So there's a lot of really cool videos. If you want to look them up, it's just really cool to see. Up next, then we've got spatial memory in food storage of birds. So here what we're talking about is birds that cache food. So when we're talking about caching, that really just means they're taking food from one place and storing it in another place for use later. So this is an adaptation to survive a predictable food storage. So we see this a lot in birds that do not migrate. So non-migratory birds, such as the birds we see around here, which are parrots or chickadees and titmice, corvids, so jays, crows, nutcrackers, and then sitids, which would be like nuthatches. So here we've got a black-capped chickadee, here we've got a type of corvid, and then here we've got our little nuthatch. So there is neural specialization in these birds. So we see this in the hippocampus, which is larger in these birds relative to their brain and body size than in birds that don't store food. And it's thought that that's because these birds need more hippocampus space, more memory storage space to remember where they left their food. So studies of food caching are a major source of information about spatial memory as well as episodic memory in non-human species. And this caching behavior is related to an ecological factor and, of course, varies a lot among species and within different populations of the same species. So, for example, chickadees, black-capped chickadees, have a huge range. They're all the way from mid to southern the U.S. all the way up to Alaska, all over Canada. So some species of chickadees from Alaska perform better on a non-caching spatial memory task, but not better at a non-spatial learning task when compared to a species of chickadee from, say, Colorado, where it's more southern and there's food available year-round in Colorado, or more available in Colorado than it would be in Alaska, because the winters are longer in Alaska and there's not as many seeds and stuff in Alaska to be available. Also, there's a lot less people, which means less bird feeders. So we see differences in ability within species as well as between species. So why is this feat of memory so remarkable? Well, memories are formed during a single brief visit. So these birds that are caching food, they only cache food in a certain place once. So every time they get new food and they're going to put it somewhere, they put it in a new place. So not only do they have to remember where I kept my food so I can go get it, but they have to remember where did I already put food so I don't put more food too close by. And so most memory, then you need some sort of, a little bit of rehearsal. They say, ideal memory is you need to remember something, let's say, talk about it 7 times or something like that. Whereas here, then they're only having one very brief single visit. They also have to remember a very large number of things. So they will put seeds all over their territory. So looking at these territories, then we've seen that animals can cache between 10,000 and 100,000 sites per year. So that means every year they have to remember 10 to 100,000 new places of where they put food. So this information is also retained over a very long period of time. So for instance, Clark nutcrackers will remember their locations for over 285 days. So almost like 2/3 of the year, they have to remember this 10 to 100,000 items for 2/3 of the year. So that's not only a large number of things to remember, but it's a long time that they have to remember it. Now, is it actually memory? That is one question. Some people ask whether or not this is actually memory or if there's something else going on. So we need to rule out other possible caching strategy, which would be searching randomly and getting lucky. Are they just putting food in so many places so that no matter where they search, they find food? Is the stored food in particular types of locations? So do they only store it in, say, birch trees? Do they only store it under rocks or something like that? Do they mark their food storage sites? Do they mark the territory? Do they put little cues of some sort? Is there an olfactory cue? So, do they mark the territory by, excreting themselves in some sort of way? So in order to figure this out, then we've actually conducted a number of controlled laboratory experiments to study all of these issues. So the lab studies will manipulate one or even two of these mechanisms to determine is the bird using these mechanisms instead of memory. And now remember that all of these four other possible strategies are non-memory mechanisms. So if they're using memory, then they won't use these. Or if they're using these, then it's probably not memory. So one such of these studies would be by Camille and Balda in 1985. So they forced Clark's nutcrackers, so pictured here, to cache in only 18 of 180 spots. So in other words, you're going to need a little background here. So Clark's nutcrackers live in an alpine area of the western United States, and they tend to harvest seeds from pine cones in the late summer and early autumn. So that means they're going to cache about 33,000 seeds, and it needs to last them from winter to spring. Now, in each cache, so in each location, they're going to put 4 to 5 seeds. That's what these animals tend to do. Now, what happened is that they created this false environment. So these are laboratory animals. So here, then you can see there's a square here, a grid, and each of these little dots is a possible place that the animal can cache food. Okay, and then all of these other things on top of the thing is just different enrichment. So they could be trees, rocks, some sort of branch, a cage of some sort, just different things in the environment. So those would be like those landmark cues that could help with memory, perhaps. But in each of these little holes is the possibility for caching. So you can see there's 180 spots. So what happened, or there were 180 spots. This is less, but you get it. So what happened is they covered up all of these dots except for 18. And so they allowed the nutcrackers to cache food then, and after 10 days, with no lids and 4 recovery sessions, then they studied what happened. So they would either rake the sand to cover up some holes, or if the animal cached food in a non-approved place, they would actually remove the food. And what they saw then was they looked at how did these animals search for food when they were no longer being given food. And they saw that these birds were not searching at random. They were actually retrieving the food by looking where they put it. So the sites were not marked. So all locations were covered with sand that the experimenter raked. So it's not like they could see it, which means that they were actually going to a certain spot that they had previously cached food in and looking there, probably using some landmark cues. There didn't seem to be a preference for location site because the experimenter controlled the 18 spots they could cache. And it's not like, and they did this with a bunch of birds, and the birds would all go to a different caching spot first or second. So it's not like there was a preferred caching spot. They just knew where they had cached it and then did it. There were also no odor cues going on because all tests, and the food was removed. They washed everything, of course, so that the animals couldn't mark a territory or something. And even then, these nutcrackers were able to successfully find their cached food very quickly, above chance level. So the results suggest that the birds, because they performed above chance level, caching the food can't be due to marking the sites, so the marked sites. It can't be due for preference location type, because the experimenters controlled for location type. And it can't be due to olfaction, because again, the experimenters controlled for it. So that suggests that yes, the nutcrackers are actually using memory for where they cached their food. Now, are they using their memory for remembering when they cached it? Also probably yes. Why would that be useful? Obviously, if one type was more preferred over the other. So for example, with chickadees, who I work with, they'll eat pretty much anything, but their favorite type of food other than worms, so their favorite type of seed, I guess, would be a sunflower seed. So when doing studies with, say, chickadees, then they will first go to sites where they had previously put sunflower seeds over, say, just some other type of seed, or corn, perhaps. They would prefer the sunflower seed, so they're going to go there first. Also, some foods may spoil or deteriorate over time. So, for example, they may store a worm or something, or a piece of suet. And so they need to remember where that piece is and when they put it there so that they know whether or not it's still good. So storing perishable foods is not very useful unless you intend to recover them very soon. So this paradigm of food caching and recovery is also used in some studies to study episodic-like memory in birds. So episodic memory is memory for a specific event or episode. So that's the what, where, and when. And you have to integrate all three of these. Of course, it can be flexible. So we use this in like novel problem solving. So, well, I did this thing before, so now I'm going to try this thing now. So you, with episodic memory, then you remember what happened, where it happened, and when it happened. You also know that this experience happened in the past. You know that you're remembering it. Now, we can't really say whether or not animals remember having these feelings, because we can't ask them. Do you remember this? Did you have this feeling? We can't ask that. Now, in 1983, then this dude, Tolvien, said that episodic memory is a uniquely human trait. And a lot of people had problems with this because the notion of something is uniquely human is really just a call for arms for scientists like me that study comparative cognition to prove you wrong. So there's been a bunch of ingenious experiments with non-human species to try to see if non-human species have episodic memory. So when doing this, then we're going to determine if animals have other features of episodic memory. So that could be the what, where, when information needs to be integrated into a coherent representation. So not just independent bits of info. We need to be able to combine all three. Also, knowledge about past episodes must be flexible to deal with novel behaviors. Birds have shown that they're capable of solving novel problems, so perhaps they're using previous memory to do that. Now, one such study that's attempted to look at episodic memory used scrub jays. So this is a scrub jay, and it's to remember the relevant time of caching food as well as the location of their cache and how much is there. So what happened here is that scrub jays, they like peanuts and they like worms. But obviously they like worms better than peanuts. So what happened is there's this fun tray, probably recognize it as an ice cube tray. We're very creative in science. And each tray would be located near a distinctive set of Legos. Again, very creative. And so what we do is we give the birds worms and peanuts and allow them to either cache it themselves or we cache the food ourselves underneath some sawdust. That's what this is. Or like even sometimes we'll use oatmeal. They don't like oatmeal. But buried within here would be either peanuts or worms, and we could change the amount of worms or the amount of peanuts in each little tray. And what we were examining is, will they choose the worms over the peanuts? Do they know the difference between which one has worms, which one has peanuts? The where, so which container has what, and the when. Did I already eat out of that container? is there food in that container or not. Now, what we did was we actually would fill up these things ourselves and say the worms would be replenished. So if they ate the worms, we'd refill it with worms every, say, 4 hours. And they would know to not, if they already ate the worms in this section, to not even bother going back to that section for another 4 hours because they know it's not going to be there. So they're going to focus on the other sections until 4 hours has elapsed, and then they'll go back. So that's the when. They know that they already went there. They know that there's no worms there. They know where within the tray they're avoiding. So all groups of the birds would search for the worms more than the peanuts after 4 hours. And there were different groups. So there was a deteriorate group, which searched for peanuts more than worms after 124 hours, because in this group, then the worms were not replenished. In the replenished group, then they would search for worms more than peanuts after 124 hours, because that's when all worms were replaced. So they knew that after a while, I can search for worms. Whereas the deteriorate group knew there's no point in searching for worms. They're not going to be there. So this is showing that the birds did remember what they cached. They remembered where they cached it and when they cached it. Now, with the replenished group, then they were replenished in less than 124 hours. It was usually like 4 hours or even 24 hours. But they didn't actually search for the worms as much. They waited longer. And so we showed the what, where, and when, but not so much the how long when. The fact that the deteriorate group changed its choice depending on how long the worms had been did indicate that they remembered when things had stashed. But the replenish group suggests that remembering the full amount of time was a lot harder. Now, when doing a similar study with rats and monkeys, other researchers have shown all 3 W's as well. Again, inspired by this really cool study. So that's it for tool use and food caching for birds. In the next video, then we'll talk about some perceptual concepts and language.